Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of you, wherever you are in the world. This is episode 23 of the Found Christianities series. I'm Dr. David Liva, and I'm so glad that you can join me. In this episode, we're covering the topic of chapter 23 in the book Found Christianities, and this is the Alexandrian figure who is named as Julius Cassianus. All right, so interestingly enough, we only know about Cassianus through another Christian writer, as is sometimes the case. This Christian writer is Clement of Alexandria. And if you pick up his stromata, or sometimes called stromates, these are online. In the back portion of book 3, he critiques Julius Cassianus's book called On Self-Control, also called On Being a Eunuch. And so initially, Clement starts, he wants to refute Cassianus, so he starts by quoting, but then he gets a bit tired and just starts paraphrasing. Then he gets even looser and starts fitting Cassianus into a larger circle of Christians who supported complete sexual abstinence. So sometimes it's a little bit difficult to understand Cassianus's view because it's through Clement that we understand him. And when Clement criticizes something, we can often intuit that that's Cassianus's view. I've gone ahead and translated the fragments of Cassianus for you, which gives you a sense of what I think is coming from Cassianus. So I'm going to upload that to the Patreon site, and you can make time for that and make your own decisions about what you think Cassianus is actually representing. Obviously, this is my take, just a guider and a teaser. Our basic understanding of Julius Cassianus is that he thrives between 160 and 180 in Alexandria. He's only quoted by Clement of Alexandria. He appears to be only active in Alexandria. Now, Berger Pearson, who gave us the critical edition in English of the Testimony of Truth, which is Nag Hammadi Codex 9.3, argued that this Nag Hammadi Codex, which is a great read, by the way, highly recommended, go look this up. He argued that this treatise, which is unfortunately fragmentary, was written by Julius Cassianus. And I've more and more warmed up to this idea, but ultimately you'll have to make your own decisions. Clement says that Cassianus was supposedly a former Valentinian, and that makes a bit of sense because Cassianus definitely is familiar with Valentinian ideas and uses some Valentinian notions. We'll get to the birth through Mary in a second. But Cassianus definitely rejects other Valentinian ideas, chiefly the idea that marriage is a sacrament, that it's a symbol, and that salvation is about marriage to an angel, all that Julius has absolutely no time for. So possibly he moved from one camp to another. We don't really know his backstory. The basic point for Julius Cassianus is that for whatever reason, and we can speculate about this, he came to see sex and procreation as totally incompatible with Christian faith. Now, here's a point where, if you love the Gnostics, you can't pick and choose, This view is obviously no longer popular today, but there you go. I mean, it's often the Orthodox Catholics who are now, pounded because, they made people feel guilty about sex and so on and so forth. That is absolutely true in many cases, but it's not only Catholics who in the early centuries of Christianity are really, really against sex. And I think one of the very, important things about this whole discussion is to try to understand where these people are coming from. And if you think they're wrong, as I also have my own qualms here, that's fine. I'm going to present this data as neutrally as I can, and you can take it how you wish. So what does he think about sex and sexuality? Well, he rejects mortal intercourse, that is, intercourse between material bodies, not only because God is spirit, and so the ultimate imitation of God is to become a spiritual being, but he also considered that human souls in their natural and original state were spirits, okay, that they didn't have bodies which decayed, all right? And that's very important, that we are naturally immortal beings, and that our home naturally is heaven, not earth. Now, we find ourselves in bodies because we or our progenitors have been deceived. And we've been deceived by, as in Genesis, the snake. But in our current life, we've been deceived by the Creator. And the Creator's goal is to keep us trapped in mortal bodies because he likes to rule things, and he is the creator of matter, or the organizer of matter. And like any dictator or autocrat, he likes to keep people in his control. So if he can keep you locked up in a mortal, corruptible, decaying body, he will. He'll also trick you into thinking that you should be grateful to him because you are born in this corruptible body. Born to die. Whatever is born in this kind of body dies. Whereas the true gnosis says, if you really awaken to your true self, you realize that you are an immortal being. Now that's Valentinus, okay, but it's also Cassianus, and it's that realization which says that our natural state isn't in a body which decays. Okay, so how does this all play out? Well, interestingly enough, in mid-second century Alexandria, we know that there were Christians who actually went through the process of medical castration, or at least they applied to do so, because that was against Roman law at the time. Cassianus is not so radical. He really doesn't really matter whether you cut your testicles off. What matters is that you abstain even from sexual thoughts. Okay. Now, if you think cutting your testicles off is radical, well, just keep in mind that Origen of Alexandria did this. Okay. So, I mean, here's a very, very well-known and respected Christian who's often, warmed up to the Orthodox camp, who was engaged in this activity. So, on this position, on this fundamental ethical position, it really these outdated categories and anachronistic categories of who's Orthodox and who's something that's not Orthodox, it really don't matter, okay? Because everybody can be, have a variety of positions, okay? And you can have a certain theology and a certain ethics, and you might have a so-called Orthodox theology, but not an Orthodox ethics, and vice versa, so on and so forth. Well, how did Cassianus go about actually rooting and grounding his position? He went back, as any Christian would, to Jesus, okay? And he finds this basic datum, of course: Jesus doesn't marry or have children, okay? Now, recently this has been disputed. There was supposedly a fragment saying that Jesus had a wife. This has been debunked as a forgery in modern times, okay? Interesting story, but it is definitely a forgery. And this whole Dan Brown thing about Jesus having sex with Mary Magdalene and producing a descendants, all that really is pretty much modern too. Okay, that doesn't exist in the ancient world. In the ancient world, there's really no dispute. Jesus is not at all interested in sex. He appears on the pages of the gospel as completely an asexual being. All right, and there's nothing really to say against that. And even the so-called, apocryphal gospels or non-canonical gospels, they have basically the same presentation. One of these is called the Gospel of the Egyptians, and this is, interestingly, is one of the gospels that Cassianus quotes. And he quotes it because Jesus in this gospel is portrayed as saying that the mortal body is a garment of shame. And what should we do with the garment of shame? We should trample it. Okay, so for obvious reasons, he liked this particular passage. But he could also simply go to the canonical gospels, where Jesus in Matthew 19:12 praises those who make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of God. If you're making yourself a eunuch, I mean, you might be literally cutting your genitals off, but more likely you are spiritually abstaining from sexuality and sexual thoughts and so on and so forth. That seems to be praised by Jesus. It seems to be what he himself does. Another saying, which Cassianus quoted, was that, Jesus supposedly says, if you don't hate your spouse and children, you can't enter the kingdom of God. All right. So somebody who says that, I mean, is really not into family values. And this is sort of a humorous point. I mean, in America, evangelicals want to make Jesus, the proponent of family values. He's pretty much the opposite of that. Okay, let's face it. Saying things like this, Cassianus says, how could this guy be in support of birth and family and procreation? He's obviously not. He tells you to hate your own children. Okay. Cassianus also believed that Jesus passed through Mary. All right. He believed in a virgin birth, apparently, but Jesus is sort of like a guest in Mary's womb. He's not taking flesh. It's not like a normal pregnancy where he is, taking the matter from the mother, all right, and being formed inside her. No, he's formed inside her, yes, but he's not taking anything from Mary, which is an interesting view because it seems to be basically the Valentinian view. The Valentinian view was in the famous image that Jesus passed through Mary like water through a tube. It's sort of a funny image, but the water going through the tube doesn't pick up anything from the tube. Okay. So this may have implied that Jesus didn't have flesh from Mary. What kind of body he did have, we really don't know. Actually, because our only source, Clement, doesn't really tell us what kind of body Jesus had. And so we're up a river on that one. Now you can also appeal to Paul, okay? And Paul has that famous phrase, which, it's the absolute terror of, the Orthodox understanding of the resurrection. But Paul says flesh and blood cannot inherit God's kingdom, okay? And he's talking about actual physical bodies here. He's not talking about humanity in general. So if there's no flesh and blood in the salvific state, then there is apparently no mortal coupling. Okay. There can be no coupling of fleshly decaying bodies if you don't have one. Okay. And let's face it, when you're in the spiritual state or the spiritual realm, you don't need to reproduce, so you don't need to engage in the practice, which ends up in reproduction. Okay. Another passage that Cassianus quoted was Philippians 3:20. Sometimes, I'm translating it, our municipalities in heaven, but it could be, it often appears as our citizenship is in heaven. This for Cassianus was proof that, our natural state was to be heavenly beings. And our supernatural state, or our post-mortem state, if we are saved, is to end up back into that supernal realm. And in that realm, mortal bodies cannot dwell. And if mortal bodies don't dwell, then there's no mortal sex. Okay. Something else Paul said, which really struck a chord with Cassianus, was that our struggle, and the full quote here is, our struggle is not against blood and flesh, okay, but it's against the spirit beings, okay. And it's also against beings that Paul called the cosmocrators. And the chief cosmocrator, that is the world ruler, was the creator. Okay. So Cassianus did definitely see himself as in opposition to the creator. Like Marcion, like the Sethians, he seemed to have had hostility toward the creator, because the creator is that being who says in Genesis 1:28, be fruitful and multiply. And that really is the worst possible thing you can do, because you're just propagating the creator's realm. The creator himself is not a spirit being. He is the organizer of matter and simply wants to keep you in his little domain, and to have a bunch of kids who also get to stay in that domain. And your only fate here is simply to grow old and die. If you're born in a fleshly body, you will die. That is your fate. And that is why we oppose the Creator, according to Julius. We do not give thanks, we fight. So there you have it. This isn't the full presentation. Obviously, for that, you can head to the book, chapter 23, and make your own decisions. Okay. This kind of stuff, take it or leave it. It really doesn't matter in the end if you agree with it. Okay. What matters, I think, ultimately is that you understand it and understand the logic, so that when you really understand it, you can really make it an informed and intelligent decision. Maybe you think this is all bunk, or maybe for the first time you've understood why Christians seem so anti-sex, because it's all sorts of Christians who take up this position for a different reason. And whether you love the Creator or you hate the Creator, you can take up this position and find a biblical basis for it. Well, that's enough for me. Thank you all so very much for coming and supporting this channel. And I really, really appreciate it and wish you well. Take care, and we'll see you next time.